Thanks for being with us here on Morning Live. Now, the Special Investigating Unit, that's the SIU, now they say they had to date investigated 5,467 COVID-19 contracts to the value of 14.3 billion rand, which were awarded to just over 3,000 service providers across all spheres of government. And of that number, 4,549 contracts have been finalized, with 62% of those found to have been irregular. Now, the unit has recovered over 34 million rand in assets and money, while 551 million rand still needs to be recovered. And this report does not, however, include details of the ongoing investigations that were not included after a specific timeline was set. Now, former head of the Special Investigating Unit, as well as former Deputy National Director of Public Prosecutions, Willie Hofmeyr, joins us now for further conversation on this. Willie, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, and thank you for having me on your show.
So the presidency says that 45 matters with a combined value of 2.1 billion rand have been brought before the Special Tribunal of Corruption. But there are over 2,800 contracts that are said to be irregular. Does that mean that those that are irregular don't fall under criminal activity?
It will depend a bit on the circumstances in each case. Irregular just means that all the processes were not followed through properly, so the contracts would be invalid. But, I think a detailed investigation will be needed to see whether there was criminality involved as well.
So if we look at those numbers of the 4,549 contracts that we are told were finalized, with 62% of which is more than half the number of the contracts investigated, were irregular. How does that complicate, for example, the life of not just the SIU, but also the NPA when it comes to actually dealing with those matters that need to be prosecuted?
Maybe I should just clarify for a moment. So the SIU doesn't have the mandate to institute criminal cases. So it does investigations. If it comes across irregularities, as it did here, the SIU can use its powers to recover the money. But in cases where it's clear that there should be a criminal case, it refers the cases and the evidence that it's gathered to the NPA to consider doing a full criminal case.
Indeed. So in that case, if we look at the matters that are, let's start with the monies that are recovered, and we are told 34 million rand in assets so far, and yet the figures we are looking at are absolutely staggering. What are some of the difficulties that are generally encountered by a unit such as the SIU in trying to recover some of these proceeds?
I think the problem with investigating corrupt activities is that people make a lot of efforts to cover their tracks. And, so it's very important when you do those investigations to make sure that you have dealt with all the evidence that you have, that people do not come to court later and say, no, but this is our defense, and that was not an aspect that was fully investigated at the time. So it is very, by its nature, to deal with corrupt activities and corruption cases. It is a fairly slow and very detailed process that one has to go through to make sure that people can't come up with some other explanation that you may not have covered in your investigation.
Willie, you say slow and detailed. Explain to us why this onerous detail when it comes to recuperating the funds, whereas it seems to be quite easy when it is paid out. It's paid out to a certain entity, and obviously it's a matter of following the trail of that money. But why then is it so difficult?
It's just because one is coming in from the outside, so you don't actually know what the detailed transactions were about. So you have to really investigate the details of all the transactions that have taken place to see which ones may have been normal commercial transactions, which ones have an indication of criminality. So that's just, unfortunately, the nature of white-collar crime, is that one has to do a very detailed investigation before one ends up in court.
Do you think that, we do have sufficient capacity and competence in the various entities like the SIU, like the NPA, to actually deal with these complex matters, as you point out? Because if we look at the number of companies, if we look at the detail outlined in this latest report, why is it so difficult? Because you can go back to something like Steinhoff. Leanne was in conversation with Rob Rose yesterday about the latest developments around Steinhoff. Why is it seemingly almost impossible, when we are dealing with big money, to follow that money trail successfully?
It's less of a challenge to follow the money trail. But I think the problem with economic crime cases is that people can come up with a lot of explanations about what happened during the process. So when you do the criminal investigation particularly, it's very important that you investigate all the possible explanations that people may come up with, so that you don't end up in court with people charged criminally, and then suddenly they produce some new evidence that hadn't been in your possession previously. So unfortunately, that's just the nature of investigating complex economic crime, is that it is a long and tedious process that has to be done very thoroughly. And I think it's important that we don't put undue pressure on the law enforcement bodies to try and rush these investigations. They just have to be done very properly and thoroughly.
So if we look at this latest report, Willie, and you hear the figures, 62% of the contracts that have been issued by government have been irregular. Is that normal, or is this an indicator of something more sinister? And obviously, and I'm just begging your indulgence on the last part of this question, could this be a possible indicator of a nation on a slippery slope?
I think you are correct, and that is that these things really can only be done with the collaboration of people in the state and probably in the ruling party. And, I think that's partly what makes these investigations very, very difficult to do, and why it is so important that you're absolutely sure about your facts.
So if we look at the presidency, of course, releasing this particular report, saying the SIU would refer any evidence of criminal activity to the NPA. Then a few weeks ago, we saw the Zondo report also coming out, and the NPA is still applying its mind to that. Now, the faith in the NPA has waned. Isn't this all too perplexing for the NPA that haven't really, proved to have a handle on a lot of these high-profile cases, especially as yet?
I think we must remember, like most other government institutions, the NPA was also captured under when Sean Abrams essentially became the National Director of Prosecution, having been a very junior prosecutor before that. So I think the damage and the appointments that were made in bodies like the NPA by bad people when they were in charge is one of the things that we have to rebuild in law enforcement. We do need a bigger NPA, we need a more skilled NPA, and we need people who really have the experience to deal with these very complicated and big economic crime cases. And just to mention that very few of those cases have been done in the last 10 years, so there's not that many people who have actual experience of doing those cases.
But for how long would that particular argument be valid in mitigation, Willie? Because at some point, we need to stop using that argument. At some point, we need to fix these institutions, especially when the public is not taken into confidence to say, this is what happened, these are the stumbling blocks that we are facing in this particular entity. For how long can one realistically expect the public to be satisfied with that explanation?
No, I tend to agree with your point. But I also think it would help for the NPA to talk a little bit more about the difficulties that it faces in rebuilding itself after the years of state capture. I think at the moment, one almost gets the sense that the NPA wants to try and forget about all that and get on with the future. But, you know, the problem both for the Hawks investigation and the NPA prosecutions, I think those institutions were damaged quite deeply, and it's not going to be quick fixes to get them right.
So, having worked at very senior positions at both these institutions that we've been talking about, the NPA and the SIU, Willie, with the benefit of hindsight, with what we've just touched on now, if we look at what's happening there, what do you believe needs to be done in order to equip them sufficiently and also restore public confidence in these entities to actually do their jobs?
No, I do think the sort of resolution that was taken by the NPA to set up a dedicated corruption fighting agency is the right way to go. The problem with the NPA particularly is and the police is that they have many, many high-profile cases of rape and sexual assaults and all sorts of terrible murders that the public demand immediate action on. So I think it's very important that we bring the people fighting corruption into the single body, an anti-corruption body, that deals with all corruption investigation and where people are focused only on corruption investigations and don't end up having to deal with all the many other gruesome cases that happen in our country.
So what about the investigative directorate in the NPA and, what that was supposed to do? Because seemingly this is a new entity that was set up. What have we seen from it thus far?
I think the investigating directorate was set up to deal with these cases. But, I think the reality is it is still operating in an environment which is tainted. The NPA has not, I think, fully come to terms with the bad people that are still in the body. So that's why I think if we're looking for solutions to the future, the idea of setting up an anti-corruption body that takes all the good people in the NPA and the SIU that have corruption investigation expertise, put them all together in one body, and I think we will see a lot more movement much faster on all these cases.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, former head of Special Investigating Unit and also former Deputy National Director of Public Prosecutions and former head of the Asset Forfeiture Unit, Willie Hofmeyr, commenting on the SIU report that was released yesterday and also sharing his knowledge, having worked at both the SIU and the NPA. And the SIU, of course, expects to complete outstanding matters between March and April this year and then to submit a supplementary report in June regarding the PPE tender fraud. So that brings us up to 7.